Howard had been a cab driver for many years. He had to drive different passengers, and each one had its own story, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, and even scary. But what happened to him recently really shocked him. That day he took a regular customer to a nearby town. Already on the way back out of town, a little girl of about 6 years old jumped out right under the wheels of his car. Howard barely had time to slow down and drove to the opposite side of the road. After jumping out of the car, he rushed in horror to the place where he saw the child. She was crying, but apparently just from fright. The man took the girl in his arms and looked around for an adult, but there was no one around. Then he put the child in the car, gave her a drink of water, and tried to ask her what happened and where her parents were.
"My name is Daisy," the little girl answered, sobbing. "I was walking alone to the cemetery and got lost. Will you take me there?"
Why would such a little girl want to go to the cemetery? Only adults go there, replied Howard in surprise, wondering what he should do with her now.
"I usually visit when I'm feeling bad or scared. My mother is buried there. I need to talk to her,"
said the girl, suddenly serious, and waved her hand in the direction where there really was a cemetery. Howard hesitated for a moment, but decided to drive the child to the cemetery first and see what would happen, and then decide whether to take her home or to the police. On the way, Howard asked where the girl's father was and who she even lived with.
"Daddy is often drunk or not at home," Daisy said sadly. I live with Helen. That's Daddy's new wife, and I hate her."
The girl sobbed and burst into tears again. Finally, Howard began to understand something. More likely, the girl's relationship with her stepmother had not worked out, so she was cranky. He stopped the car near the cemetery and, not knowing why, followed the girl. She ran up to one of the graves, sat down on its lap, and began to say something. Howard came closer and couldn't believe what he was hearing.
"Mummy, I was in so much pain today, but I didn't cry. She was hitting me again, yelling at me, and then she grabbed me by the hair and dunked me in a bowl of cold water. I was so scared and cold. I started choking, and then she let me go. I don't want to stay there anymore. Daddy's gone, and she's going to beat me again."
Howard became numb with horror. He could not believe that an adult could abuse a child like that. 15 minutes later, Daisy was sitting in Howard's car again, telling her story.
"Dad and Mum loved each other. All was well with us. Only Daddy's mother often came over when Mama was away and called her bad words. She also mentioned some good Helen that Daddy should want to marry. I often told Mum about it, but she always smiled and said that she wasn't mean and wouldn't hold a grudge. And then one day Mum came in tears, and they spoke with Dad for a long time in the kitchen. I tried to overhear their conversation, but I couldn't hear much. Mum said that the doctor had said that it wouldn't be long, and that I wasn't really Dad's daughter, and that Grandma wouldn't let me live in peace. And then my mum got really sick. I often sat at her bedside, talking to her and reading her stories."
Daisy looked sadly at Howard and continued the story. One morning, Daisy went to her mother's room as usual, but her father wouldn't let her in. He said that Mother had gone, and he had locked her in her room. The next time Daisy saw her was at the cemetery. The girl cried, grabbed her mother's hand, and asked her to get up. But her father forcibly took her away, and she never saw her again. A few days later, Grandma came and brought Helen with her. Her father was drunk at the time.
He had been drinking a lot since Daisy's mother had been sick. Helen and Grandma cooked a meal and put Dad to bed. Then Grandma left. But Helen went to sleep on the couch with Dad, and she stayed home forever. A few days later, Helen gathered all of Daisy's toys and put them in the closet. "I don't want that junk in the house," she shouted at Daisy. "If you want to play, go to the closet." Father, meanwhile, was all the time at work or drunk. Daisy heard Helen complaining to him every day about her bad behaviour and reminding him about the orphanage. At first, Dad tried to object, but then he just kept quiet. And meanwhile, Daisy's life turned into a living hell. Helen hardly fed her, dragged her by the hair, beat her when her father wasn't home. When Daisy told him about it, he did not believe her. Helen beat her every day and locked her in the dark basement, knowing how afraid Daisy was of the dark. And yesterday, the girl overheard Helen talking to her grandmother and father. The women had long convinced Daisy's father that she was mentally ill and should be sent to a special boarding school, and he finally agreed. That's when Daisy ran to the cemetery to tell her mother about her misfortune, and on the way her paths crossed with Howard. The man was shocked. "Do you have another grandmother?" he asked thoughtfully. "Yes, my mother said I had one, but I've never seen her. Mum said they had a big quarrel once, and they hadn't spoken since." Daisy was talking so maturely about all this that a chill ran down Howard's spine. He thought deeply. Taking her home would mean exposing the child to abuse again, but keeping her with him was against the law. Finally, he decided to look at the girl's house. When Howard drove up to the right house, he stopped nearby to observe. He could see that the house was well maintained, and thought that most likely decent people were living there. At that moment, a beautiful woman came out of the house, and Howard was just going to get out of the car and talk to her, but when he saw what she had done, he abruptly changed his mind. A neighbour's dog ran up to the woman, wagging his tail in a friendly way, but she kicked the dog with a swing, and the poor creature, squealing with resentment, flew aside, while the woman smiled and went on. Now Howard was sure that everything Daisy had told him was true. He understood that he was acting illegally, but he could not give the child to that cruel woman. Howard's wife, Melanie, worked in the clinic as an ophthalmologist, and Howard resolutely drove to her work. When the pale husband asked Melanie to examine some crying girl for bruises and contusions, she was at first frightened that he had hit the child by the car. She called the traumatologist, and he, after a long examination, said, "Howard, where did you get her?" Judging by the nature of the injuries, she was beaten long and methodically. "I must report to the police." Listening to Daisy's story, the old doctor rubbed his nose sullenly, and Melanie could not hold back her tears and sobbed out loud. Howard himself was ready to cry. He had his own children, though already grown, but he had never even thought of hitting one of them. Altogether, they decided that they simply had to help Daisy. Next was the police, interrogations and medical reports. The girl was temporarily admitted to the children's hospital. Daisy liked it there and quickly made friends with the other girls. One day, one of them, Lily, was visited by her mother, or rather, as it turned out later, her stepmother, and Daisy was simply amazed. The stepmother brought the girl some fruit, candy, carefully persuaded her to eat, but Lily behaved disgustingly. She scattered the presents and turned away, refusing even to speak to the woman. When her stepmother left, Daisy asked Lily sympathetically, "Are you getting beaten up at home too?" "Me? Of course not." The girl was greatly surprised. "Then why are you so angry with your stepmother?"
and then Lily, pouting capriciously, explained to Daisy that her father and mother had divorced, and Lily had stayed with her father, and soon he married a second time. Lily considered that this new wife had illegally taken her mother's place. Then Daisy told Lily her story, and at the end, swallowing her tears, added that if she had had such a stepmother, she would have loved her very much. The next time, when the stepmother came to visit Lily again, the girl welcomed her with a smile, and they sat there, hugging for a long time. Meanwhile, Howard had found the address of Daisy's second grandmother. As it turned out, Mrs. Nelson knew nothing about her daughter's death, or about her granddaughter's life. Learning all, this unfortunate woman could not calm down for a long time, cursing herself for her obstinacy, and then quickly got ready, and they went to get Daisy. On the way she kept crying, telling Howard the story of Daisy's mother. Penelope had always been very stubborn. Once a team of geologists came to town and she fell in love with one of them. After the work was done, the geologists left, and Penelope decided to follow him. Mrs. Nelson tried to dissuade her, but it was no use. Her daughter left, and Mrs. Nelson cried every day, feeling that her daughter would not have a good life. And so it turned out. One day, Penelope was visited by that geologist's wife. The woman was in her last month of pregnancy. She was looking for her husband, who was drunk at Penelope's apartment at the time. The woman said that he already had 2 children, and 2 more were soon to be born. In addition, as it turned out, the man was addicted to gambling, and although most of the time she managed to keep him in line, but sometimes he would run away and go on a binge, find himself a mistress, gamble again, and get drunk. It finally dawned on Penelope what kind of situation she was in. And the most horror was that Penelope was already pregnant too. She did not say anything to her lover's wife, and quietly packed her things and went back to her mother. But when they met, word for word, the women argued, and Penelope grabbed her suitcase and ran out the door. Mrs. Nelson thought that her daughter would calm down and come back, but they never saw each other again. And she did not even know that she had a granddaughter, and that Penelope had gotten married. Howard felt very sorry for the elderly woman, but he also realized that if both women had not been so stubborn, many problems could have been avoided. Time passed. Howard and his wife now often came to visit Daisy and her grandmother. Helen was convicted. Daisy's father was also facing punishment, but the man got off with a probationary sentence. Later, Howard heard rumors that he had completely lost his way and once froze somewhere drunk. Daisy went to a new school, and studying was easy for her. She and her grandmother lived amicably, in love and respect for each other. True, the teachers sometimes said that Daisy, though a quiet girl, but the children were afraid of her for some reason. Howard was not surprised, and was well aware of what she meant. The girl's talk was too rational for her age, and he had never seen such a piercing look.